Today's daf we're learning is Eruvin Samachet. Today's shiur is dedicated in memory of Rana Samuel's Ofran, Zichrona Levracha, by Erin Piateski. We're going to start now at the bottom, about 7 lines from the bottom of Samach Zayin Amud Bet. We're going to start a slew of stories about children or babies, infants who are right probably before the Brit Milah. It's a bit of a debate. It was a thing that they would wash, and we've seen this before. They would bathe the babies in hot water as preparation for the Brit Milah. Some people say, or maybe some of the stories were after the Brit Milah, not 100% clear, but related to the Brit Milah, they needed this hot water. And in all these cases, they had hot water prepared and the water spilled and they were stuck and they didn't have a way to get water. So we're going to start with the first story, Hau Yanuka. They're all going to start off in the same way. There was a certain child, a baby, his hot water spilled. Amar lehu Rabba. Rabba says, why don't we bring him water from a house? Amar le Abaye, v'halo Eruvin. Abaye says to Rabba, remember their relationship? Abaye was adopted by Rabba. Abaye is always in contact with him. Also, Rabba was his teacher, and he's always asking questions. And he says, but we didn't do an Eruv. So how are we going to do this? Now, it seems strange. What, Rabba didn't know they didn't do an Eruv? So keep that in mind. We're going to see later that maybe he really didn't know. Okay, and we're going to see that the first 2 questions he asked are more technical. Rabba's going to say, why don't we do this? Okay, he says, well, we don't have an Eruv, so we can't carry the water from here to the next door courtyard because there's no Eruv. Amarle, nismocha shituf. Maybe we could say, well, there's shituf mevo'ot between all the chatzerot. So maybe then we could bring the water from our courtyard to their courtyard. We could rely on that, even though there's no Eruv. Amarle, halo shatfinan. But we didn't do shituf mevo'ot either. Remember, the Eruv chatzerot is for the houses within one courtyard to be able to carry from their houses to the courtyard. The Eruv shituf mevo'ot is to allow things that were in the courtyards to be able to be carried from courtyard to courtyard. But he says we didn't do that either. So Nochri leitele. So he says, why don't you tell a Nochri then to bring it? Okay, have a non-Jew, a Gentile, have him come and have him bring the water for us. If you remember, Amira la'akum is a shvut, which means one is not allowed to do this. It's a derabanan. But in this case, he says maybe we should allow it for the purposes of the mitzvah of Brit Milah. So Amar Abaye, now it's interesting. Until now, Abaye had no problems questioning Rabba on what he said. But now Abaye says, Bai la'ot ve'lamar. I really wanted to ask him about what he just said and question him on this. However, he said, Lo shavkan Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef wouldn't allow me to. The Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Kahana, because Rav Yosef said the name of Rav Kahana, Ki avina be Rav Yehuda. When I was in the house of Rav Yehuda, Amarlan, he taught me the following thing. This is a fascinating line about difference. We all talk often about differences between rabbinic law and Torah law. Here's a very interesting one. When it comes to Doraita, if you're not sure about something, first you ask the question, and only after you resolve the issue, if you have a problem with it, if you can resolve it, then you can do it. B'Rabbanan, it's the opposite. Avdinan ma'aseh. If you have a question on someone who's about to do something that maybe potentially it's going to be forbidden by the rabbis, by rabbinic law, you first let them do what they plan to do, the hadar mutvinan tiyuvta, and only after do you question. Now, we saw this before. Remember the rabbis with the Eruv, with the Bitul Rishut, or the Schirut with the Nochri, and then they said, we'll ask later, right? So it was the same idea. If you're dealing with rabbinic law, first you do it. If you think that this is what you do it. And if there's a question, you ask the question later. So therefore, he held back from asking. Now, he didn't hold back from asking originally. So why all of a sudden at this part? That's because originally it was, some people explain that there's a difference between the types of questions in the beginning and the question now. The questions in the beginning were, Rabba said, well, let's carry. And he said, we don't have an Eruv. It almost sounded like Rabba didn't have all the facts on the ground. So there he was just providing facts that Rabba would understand the situation. Whereas here, it's more of a halachic question. So Amarle, Ditanya. So now, I skipped a line. Amarle, my bayit leutve. So then, lebatar hachi, I skipped a few more words. After Rabba did this, basically, and they carried the hot water to the children. This is, by the way, very interesting. The whole concept of just do and don't ask is very interesting, right? Normally, we try to ask. But if it's Rabbanan, you see the problem with asking. If you open it to questions, it could go on unended, right? So basically, just, and especially here, there was a child, you need a Brit Milah. If you keep asking, you'll never get anywhere. Sometimes you just have to act and then ask your questions later. So afterwards, he says to him, okay, so my bai le'utve, what do you want to ask? Limar, Amar lei Titania. Here, I wanted to ask based on the following braita. Haza ashvut, v'amira lenochri shvut. Sprinkling the para aduma waters. These are the red heifer waters that we sprinkle to purify someone. Let's say it's Pesach. Are you allowed to, and we can sprinkle the waters on the person, but it's Shabbat. And it's Erev Pesach. And if we sprinkle the waters on the person, he can do his Korban Pesach, but it's Shabbat. We're not allowed to by rabbinic law. Why can't we do it by rabbinic law? Because sprinkling fixes the person. If you remember, we have the whole problem of fixing something. It's like makebet patish, putting the final blow. You're turning something into not usable to usable. So here we're going to turn you into not usable because you're impure to usable that you can now bring your korban. We don't allow this on Shabbat, even if it's Erev Pesach, and even if you can do the korban Pesach. So he says like this: Maza ashvut ve'eino doche et haShabbat, eina doche et haShabbat. Why don't we say, right, just like that is a Rabbanit and it's not overridden right for the purposes of a mitzvah. Likewise, Amira Lanachri Shvut and shouldn't be pushing off Shabbat. And therefore, what should you have done in this case? You should have waited till Sunday and do the Brit Milah on Sunday, right? The idea is, and this is why in this story it was before the Brit Milah, because the idea is that it's a makom mitzvah and it would basically prevent them from being able to do the Brit Milah on Shabbat. So Amarle, and now he says to him, there's two versions. I'll read you the two versions. Okay, one version ends here. So before we read the second, it'll be easier if you don't even see the end to understand the first version. So he says, and you don't distinguish between a derabanan that has an action associated with and a derabanan that doesn't have an action associated with. Okay, what's the action and not action? Well, we're going to learn further on that we always there's a lav she'ein bo ma'aseh, there's a concept. One of the main categories of lav she'ein bo ma'aseh comes up in Masechet Makot about false testimony. Lav she'ein bo ma'aseh is speaking, okay, like testifying, is speech. That doesn't have an action associated with it. So he's basically going to say the difference is haza'ah is sprinkling. There we do an action. That we're not going to be lenient with. But when you have something, it's always considered secondary if it doesn't have an action associated with it. And just telling the non-Jew to carry your water is just telling. You haven't done an action. So therefore, we're going to be more lenient with Amira La'akum than we are with haza'ah. That's the first answer, but it doesn't really match the version of the Gemara that's in front of us, because our Gemara says, "Dehamar lo amar lenochri zil achim." He's basically distinguishing between telling the non-Jew to carry the water versus telling the Gentile to warm up the water. If you would have asked him to warm up the water, heat it up, that's an action. Okay, now let's go back to what it really means. And maybe the Gemara, according to this version, should have said melechet machshevet. Remember, creative actions. All throughout Masechet Shabbat, we discussed it. It's only going to be forbidden if it's a creative action. So here, carrying, we talked about this. Hotza'ah malacha gru'ah. Remember, it's a low-level act malacha because you're not changing anything. You're just moving something from place to place. It doesn't actually change it. It just moves it. So he's making a distinction, not necessarily between haza'ah and amira la'akum. He's making a distinction, according to this version, between what you asked the Gentile to do. Did you ask the Gentile to warm it up, to do an actual action, or did you ask the Gentile to move it? Because you only asked him to move it, therefore it's allowed. But notice what Rabbi is saying is basically, notice I didn't ask the Gentile to warm up water, right? There's two possible solutions in this way. Just go to the house of the child and heat up water there. But we didn't do that, okay? The weakness of this option is, the strength of this option is it's ipe masa, lepe masa. It works perfectly with it. The weakness is it doesn't really talk about melechet machshevet. But, it's ipe masa and lepe masa would have to be melechet machshevet. The ipe masa, lepe masa works better if you say it's speaking versus sprinkling. In this version, it's not exactly masem and not maaseh because both are amira la'akum, but you can distinguish between, again, if you call it a maaseh of machsheveti, yitzirati act, which it doesn't say in the Gemara, so it's a bit of a weakness. Now we have a separate question. So now we're zooming into something else in the story. So the story we get, okay, so you can ask the Gentile to move it for you because it's for the purposes of a mitzvah. But now comes Rabba bar Rav Chanan, Amar le Rabba bar Chanan le'Abai. Mivoadi betre gavere ravere kerabanan. This alley where lived in this alleyway. Okay, I'm translating it literally, but basically let's go back to the beginning. You and Rabba, you two great Talmidei Chachamim, lived in this alleyway and nobody made an Eruv? How could that be, right? He says, Lo lahavibe lo Eruv and lo shituf. You didn't do an Eruv. You didn't do shituf mivo'ot. Now, the question is interesting, but the answer is going to be even more interesting. And it's going to teach us a bunch of things about Abai and about Rabba. Amarlei, mine avid. What could I have done? Mar, which is Rabba, lav orche. It's beneath him to be the one to take care of the Eruv, right? He's a big gadol, not his role to do this. As you see, he didn't even know, again, if you read it that way, he didn't even necessarily know that there wasn't an Eruv. Ada tarina bigger sayinhu. And I was busy learning. I didn't get to it. Lo mishkache, right? So I kind of missed my chance. I wasn't paying attention. Now, the achne lehupita besala. Now, there's a possibility. I could have taken my bread and say, listen, my bread, I'm sharing this with everybody in the mavoy. And that would have been a good solution. But what's the problem? And here you learned about Abai. It comes up in a number of sugyot. He was very, very poor, did not have a lot of food. In fact, one of the statements he makes is that you shouldn't eat at night because he wanted to enjoy whatever food he had. And if you eat at night, you don't see your food and it's not enjoyable. He is a little bit, I like to say, a little bit food obsessed. He talks about food a lot in the Gemara, and it probably because he didn't have a lot of food. So, the issue is that I don't have a lot of bread. And if I share my bread with everyone, I'm not willing to actually really share my bread with everyone. If they come and they say, I want to eat a piece of your bread, I'm not going to let them because I'll have nothing to eat. And if basically that happens, what will happen? The whole shituf, our joining together, will be canceled. Titania, as it says in the following Braita, we saw this. If one of the people in the mavoy comes to take wine or oil from the Eruv and they don't let him take, Batel Hashituf, the whole thing is canceled. So here you see, it's not going to work if I just say, well, I'll just share my bread with everyone and we'll all kind of be together. V'nikne lehu mar, so he suggests another thing. V'nikne lehu mar reviyata dechala. In other words, Rabba bar Rav Chanan is just not satisfied with these answers. Like, there's solutions. You could have done this. You could have given everyone rights to a quarter of your barrel of vinegar. Okay, you don't really need, vinegar is not worth a lot of money. That you really could have shared. So what does he answer? Tanya emish tatvim ba'otzal. There's a braita that says, for the purposes of shituf, you can't use an otzal. An otzal is items that are collected, okay, that are stored. You can't use stored items. What's the issue? The issue is that you haven't specifically designated which part of the stored items you're sharing. Stored items generally you store in bulk. So you have a lot and you're obviously not sharing all of them. So you can't do shituf with a small amount of something big without designating it. This goes back to laws of designation. Remember breira? So we're going to get back to this in a second. So now he questions Vahatanya Mishtatvim, but there's a braita that says you can use something stored up for your shituf. So Amar Rav Oshaya lo kashya. There's no difficulty. Ha Beit Shammai, ha Beit Hillel. One braita matches Beit Shammai, one braita matches Beit Hillel, and we're going to see that it's all based on, do we hold breira or no breira? Beit Shammai holds, we don't hold breira, which means you cannot use a whole storage. You can't, let's say, take this barrel of vinegar and basically say, the part that I'm sharing, when I get to the bottom of the barrel, I'll leave over a quarter, and that retroactively will be the quarter that I shared with everybody, right? Beit Shammai says you can't do that because ein breira. According to Beit Hillel, no problem. You can share the whole thing, say I'm sharing part, and when you eventually use for your own purposes 3/4, whatever's left will be the part that you designated retroactively. So that's breira. So now we're going to say, how do we know that it's machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel? I want to point out there's an issue here, a big issue, which is that before we even go on, if you say Beit Shammai is the one who holds ein breira, then basically that's the one that matches the braita that Abaye quoted to support him, which was, I hold ein mishtatvim ba'otzal, which becomes very difficult. How could Abaye be holding like Beit Shammai? We never hold like Beit Shammai. So I'll give you two answers. One is that it's not just Beit Shammai who holds ein breira. We already learned this. There's many rabbis who hold ein breira, and therefore he holds like those rabbis, okay, against Beit Hillel. But it's not the classic Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai argument, because many argued after them and it became their machloket and not just Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. Then it's a little weird. Why would the Gemara quote it in the name of Beit Shammai? Another is Abai is just trying to give some answer to Rabba Barav Hanan, who's bothering him, and he just kind of, pulled out an answer, but it's not really what he holds. Okay, he really just didn't do the Eruv. Okay, it's not that he necessarily holds that way. Obviously, it's dangerous. Once he says that, people will think he holds that way halachically. But when someone puts you into a corner or puts a gun to your head, you might say anything. So that's the way Abaye felt. Anyway, here's what we're going to see the machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. This goes back to laws of Tuma in a house. If you remember, we have a house with a lot of entrances. And the question is, when you have Tuma in the house, they theoretically, because you could theoretically carry the Tameh person, the dead person, out through, you're going to eventually take the dead body out of your house. So all the entrances, now depending on the situation, could potentially become the entrance ways, like under the lintel, could all become impure. And there's actually machloket Rambam and Rashi how to understand this. According to Rambam, we're talking about that everything was closed, and therefore the tumah would be in the windowsills and the lintels of the doors. Rashi says we're talking about that there are kelim, there are vessels that are sitting on the windowsills and under the lintels of the door. That we're actually talking about kelim and not just about the space. Anyway, we'll leave that aside right now. Let's just read the Mishnah. Ditnan. Hamet babayit v'lo ptachim harbe. There's a lot of exits to the house or entrances. Kulan tmeim. All of them become tmeim. Niftach echad mehem. But if only one is open and all the others are closed, tu tameh v'kulan torim. Then we assume that you're going to take the body out through the open one, and therefore that one is the only one that's tameh, and everything else, it's obvious that all the others you're not going to take it out through there, and therefore they're going to be pure. Chishev lahotzio, this is going to be the one for our purposes. If he intended to carry it out, I had in my mind, I plan to carry out the dead body through this window or this door, then, or right through one of the exits or through one of the windows that has 4x4, matzil al kol haptechim kulam. Then all the other entrances or exits are going to be pure. Why? So, right? So this is because you can say, this is the one I wanted. But now there's a machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel about this. Beit Shammai omrim v'hu shachishev ad shelo yamut hamet. This is only if when the person was on their deathbed, but before they died, before there was tumah, you already decided, I'm taking the person out when they die through this door. Then it works. But if the person died first, before you designated it, then this would be retroactive designation. And Beit Shammai thinks that doesn't work. So once the person died, if you hadn't yet designated it, then obviously from the second they died, everything else became impure because you hadn't designated anything. If you later designated it, well, that doesn't help you. But Beit Hillel omrim af mishe yamut hamet. Even if after the person dies, once you decide, then it turns out that retroactively you didn't need any of those other entrances for the dead body, in which case retroactively it works to say that was clearly the one, even though you only decided after, it's as if you had it in your mind before. Okay, so therefore, you see machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel about yesh breira or ein breira, and that must be why Abaye didn't use this vinegar in his barrel of vinegar, a quarter of his barrel, because he holds ein breira, which means you can't use it because it's not clear which ones you're designating. You have to designate something specific for the Eruv. Okay, moving on now. That was really an aside about this whole thing about why they didn't have an Eruv in the first place. Next situation. This is very different because this one doesn't have to do at all with Eruv, okay, this one story, but it's another story in the stories about these children, these babies, where the water got spilled. Amar lahu Rava. Now we're at Rava, not Rabba, Rabba with a hey, Rava with an aleph. He's more contemporary of Abaye rather than the generation above. Nishayle le'ime. Well, his mother, why don't we ask his mother if she needs hot water? Why would that help us? If she needs hot water, she's what we call a chola sheyesh basakana. She's a sick person. She just had a baby. She's within 8 days. So she is really what we call in a dangerous situation, right? Maybe she's still very sick. So itzricha, if she needs hot water, then what are we allowed to do for chola sheyesh basakana? Nachim le'lenochri agavime. What we can do is we can ask a nadru to heat up water for her. Once he's heating water up for her, we can basically allow more water to be heated up and add a little bit of extra water for the child, for the baby. Okay, that will resolve our issue. So Amarle Rav Misharshia Rava, Ime Ka'achlet Mare. She's not in a dangerous situation. She's sitting there eating dates. She's clearly healthy. Like, why are you saying she's in a dangerous situation? So Amarle, Imor Tunva Ba'alma Hu Denakipla. You could say she just got into a crazed fit and started eating dates, but she really is sick. Okay, I don't know why the dates are a determination of whether or not she's really sick or not, but yes, I see some laughs here. Okay. So that's our story. Again, nothing to do with Eruv. This is a different possible solution. You can have a Gentile warm up the water, okay, which we suggested before, but not for the child. The child's not considered cholesh sheyesh bo sakana, but maybe his mother is, and if the mother is, then you can allow it. Another story. This is going to be about Eruv. Okay, here we have a picture. Pull up the picture. Okay, picture number 237, our one picture for today. Okay, so before we read it inside, we have the child living in one courtyard. The next door courtyard, Rava lives in. And in his courtyard, he already has, not in his house, but in his courtyard, there's hot water. That's this big barrel here. And then you enter into his house and you get, and now we learn a little bit about the reality of their times. You get into the rooms of the men. The men lived in the rooms or hung out. I don't know if it's living quarters or not. It seems like the men had certain living quarters. The women had certain living quarters. The men lived in the area that went straight out the house. And the women lived in the inner part, right? Right? That she's inside, right? So the women lived in the inside and the men lived in the outer, which headed out to the courtyard with the door there. So you couldn't get from the women's quarters straight to the courtyard. So what does he suggest? Amar lehu Rava, pano le mane, take all my utensils, mi be gavre le be nashe, move them to the inner room of where the women live. Okay, which shows, by the way, they weren't strict about these rules. It's not like a man couldn't go hang out in the women's quarters. He says, I'm moving in for the rest of Shabbat into these inner quarters. You'll see in a minute why. Ve'ezel ve'etev hatam, I'm going to go sit there and stay there. Ve'ibate lehu hachatzer, and then I'll relinquish my rights in the courtyard to the other courtyard. Then anything that's in my courtyard can basically be brought into the other courtyard, and perfect. So I have this hot water in my courtyard. We can take that and move that because I'll basically relinquish my rights to the other courtyard, and that'll be great. Now, obviously, this is only great if you hold that you can relinquish rights from courtyard to courtyard. Remember, we had a whole debate about that yesterday and the day before about Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Can you do this? So Amarle Ravina LaRava. So Ravina says to Rava, V'hamar Shmuel, ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer. But Shmuel says you can't relinquish rights from one courtyard to another. So Rava in his courtyard can't relinquish his rights to the other courtyard. So Amarle, Rava says, Anik Rabbi Yochanan svirale damar yesh bitul mechatzer lechatzer. He says, no, what do you mean? Hold like Rabbi Yochanan very simply, and of course you can do this. So now they question more though. This is a very interesting question, which is going to lead to our whole next sugya. V'ilo several amar Shmuel. If you don't hold like Shmuel, then now, I forgot to mention, why did he want to move all the utensils into the inner space? The reason is because he's concerned that if he leaves at this point, now this gets more into relinquishing rights. I know you've been asking a lot of questions about it, and we're going to get to all of them in the next few dapim, which is, when you relinquish your rights, what happens? Well, you can no longer, it's a real relinquishing of rights, but it's not exactly a real relinquishing of rights. It's a little in between, and we're going to see a whole machloket about this today. But when you relinquish your rights, you basically say, I no longer belong to this courtyard, which means if I no longer belong to the courtyard, then what does it mean? It means that I can't carry any items from my house to the courtyard. If that's the case, he didn't want any of his utensils to be found in the outer space where the men lived, because, not outer in the house, but close to the exit to the courtyard, because he was worried he might forget. He's so used to carrying things all the time in and out of the house. He might forget, and he'll carry his stuff from the Beit Gavre into the Chatzer. So he says, listen, I'm moving in all the way inside. Number one, I don't usually live there, so it'll remind me. Number two, I'll be farther from the exit. So if I do think to move something out, by the time I get into the Beit Gavre, I'll already remember that I'm not supposed to do this. So therefore, he says, I'm moving into the inner space. So basically what he's saying is this is going to cramp my style a little for Shabbat, and it's going to change, right? I'm going to have to move. I'm going to have to move all my stuff. So they ask him, I don't understand. If you already don't hold like Shmuel, then why don't you do the following? Okay, they suggest, why don't you say, native mar beduchte, stay in your place where you normally live. Vinibata lehu leditu, you cancel your rights to the other courtyard. Then, okay, they skip this point, but it's obvious. Then you move the barrel, or whatever, it looks like a barrel, but you move your hot water to the other courtyard. You give it to the child. And then, nehadru inu v'nivtelu leilamar. Then have the other courtyard relinquish their rights to you. And then you have rights to their courtyard. And then you obviously then have rights to both courtyards. And then you can carry your stuff in your courtyard freely. It's, why don't we just do that? Okay, now you might say, right, that's crazy. What you can relinquish rights for a minute, okay, carry whatever you want, and then they can relinquish rights back. It seems a little bit crazy. But we're going to see that this is Machlok Rav and Shmuel. And what they're basically saying is, Shmuel doesn't allow for this, but Rav does. And if you're not holding like Shmuel about Bitul Reshut, then I assume you don't hold like Shmuel about this either, because this is also, so we're going to see right now. Taha Amar Rav. Rav said, Mivatlin v'chozrin u'mivatlin. One can relinquish one rights to the courtyard, and then the others can in turn, after that, relinquish their rights back to you. So basically, you're allowed to do that. So we basically say, you say answers, oh, well, I don't hold like Rav. I hold like Shmuel in that issue. Ana b'haka Shmuel spirally. In other words, I don't hold like Shmuel about one can't relinquish rights from courtyard to courtyard, but I do hold like Shmuel that you can't keep reversing this, okay? It's not the kind of thing that's reversible. So now they question and they say, wait, isn't it all one in this? Isn't it all coming from the same logic? V'ha v'lav chad tamahu. Isn't it all the same from the same reason? Now, why? My time aim mevatlim v'chozrinu mevatlim. Lav mishum dekevan debatle lereshute istelek lemihacha legamre v'havile keben chatzer acheret ve'ein bitul reshut mechatzer lechatzer. What's Shmuel's reasoning for not allowing this? First, they suggest that it must be because Shmuel holds, if I relinquish my rights to everybody here, I say, I'm relinquishing my rights. We all live in the same courtyard. I relinquish my rights. At that point, I basically become like a resident of a different chatzer. It's as if I'm not living in your chatzer anymore. If that's the case, it's as if I'm living in a chatzer acheret. And if they want to relinquish their rights to me, Shmuel says, you can't relinquish rights from chatzer to chatzer. So Shmuel's whole logic for ein mevatlim, v'chozrinu mevatlim, is because they are not allowed to relinquish their rights to me because I no longer am considered a resident of that courtyard. So if that's the case, then if you hold like Shmuel in one, you have to hold like Shmuel in the other. And you don't hold like Shmuel in one, then you shouldn't have to hold like Shmuel in the other. So why didn't you, right? Why'd you move to that inner space when you could have stayed exactly where you were? You didn't need to move all the utensils, right? You can imagine, I mean, how many utensils he must have had to start moving them all, right? Pain in the neck. Anyway, you didn't have to do that. So what does he answer? Sorry, I lost my place. Okay. So he says, Mar nami lo nivtil. And therefore, so that's just the end. And therefore, Mar nami lo nivtil. You didn't, right? You could have, no, sorry. He says, Mar nami lo nivtil. Hatam hainu tama. In other words, the reason why he says you can't relinquish your rights is not for that reason. It's hainu tama ki hechi de lo lehava milta de rabbanan kechocha betilula. Now you probably were thinking the same thing yourself. What's a chocha betilula? It will become a mockery. People will laugh at the rabbis. If you want to call bitul reshut something serious, then you can't just say, oh, I'm going to be bavato, relinquish my rights for a minute. We can move this, and then just you relinquish your rights back to me, and I can now do whatever I want. That's ridiculous. They will make a mockery of the rabbis. And one of the worst things in halacha is to make a mockery of the rabbis because our whole halachic system is built on respect for rabbis. So if we start do something that people are going to mock the rabbis, it's going to undermine the entire halachic system. So basically, that's why he holds you can't do it. Okay, now we're going to go into this machloket Rav and Shmuel. We're going to have two suggestions that maybe the debate between them is really based on a machloket Tanaim. Okay, based on a different Tanaitic debate, and we're going to try to line them up with two Tanaitic machlokot, each one to each Tana, and each time we're going to reject it, although we'll see the conclusion the Gemara comes to at the end, or at least Rav Ashi. Gufa. So let's go into depth into this machloket. Rav Amar mevatlin v'choslin u'mevatlin, Shmuel Amar ein mevatlin v'choslin u'mevatlin. That's the machloket between them. Lema Rav u'Shmuel beplugta de Rabbanan v'Rabbi Eliezer kam biflagei. Why don't we suggest that they argue about what Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis debate? What's the debate Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis? The Gemara doesn't tell us. Rashi tells us. Okay. We saw this already, that according to, okay, if you look in Rashi, Rav Amar ki Rabbanan de Amri b'matnitin beito asur lahachnisu lehotzi lo v'lahen. When I relinquish my rights in the courtyard, right? People keep asking, what does this mean? So if I relinquish my rights, it means that my house is still my house. I basically relinquish my rights to the courtyard. That's the rabbis. And therefore, you can all carry in the courtyard now. I can't because I relinquish my rights to the courtyard. You can all carry in the courtyard, but right, we're talking about just a general case, not when it's two courtyards. Let's just assume one courtyard, we're all in the shared courtyard. You all made an Eruv, I didn't. So now, but my house is still my house. I didn't relinquish my rights to my house. Okay, which means what? That I'm still really living here, according to Rashi, below havile keben chatzer acheret. Now, even though we rejected thinking that this connects with the other Shmuel, this is basically saying this connects with, is there bitul reshut min chatzer lechatzer, and that both of them even hold that you can't be mevatel from chatzer lechatzer. But Rav, who says they can relinquish their rights back to me if they want, it's because I still have rights to my house according to the rabbis. And because I still have rights to my house, I'm still considered like a resident in this courtyard, even though I don't have rights to the courtyard, which means that they can then relinquish their rights to me because I'm still a member of their courtyard. Okay. Whereas the Shmuel would hold like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, my house, one second. Did I just say that wrong? One second. Rav Amar ki Rabbanan beito asur lachnis. Right. Rabbi Eliezer holds, I said it right. Sorry, I just got confused for a second. Rabbi Eliezer holds my house is allowed to them. Okay. If my house is allowed, it means I've relinquished my rights entirely, both to my house and to my courtyard. If that's the case, I'm really considered a resident of a different courtyard because I don't really live here. Okay. Even though I'm physically here, I don't really live here. And therefore, they can't relinquish their rights back to me because I'm like someone who lives in a different courtyard. And so therefore, we're going to assume that Shmuel holds like Rabbi Eliezer, Rav holds like Rabbanan, perfect. But we're now going to say, no, each one could actually explain their opinion according to the other. Amar l'chahav, ana da'amri afilu l'Rabbi Eliezer. I could explain what I think, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that one, right, you have rights to my house, my courtyard. I'm as if I'm not here because you have rights to my courtyard. Well, now we're going to say, no, it's not as if I'm not here and I live in another courtyard. And that's why you can relinquish your rights back to me. But why don't you have rights to my house and my courtyard then? He only said it there because I'm a reshut beito bitel. The whole idea was when I relinquished my rights to my courtyard, what did I mean? Did I mean my courtyard and my house? Or did I mean just my courtyard? Now, we saw this machloket already. We saw that if I say I'm not using the courtyard, just like Rava said before, I better move inside because I use my courtyard all the time. There's no such thing as having a house without a courtyard, right? So if I am mevatel my reshut in my courtyard, clearly reshut beito bitel. The whole question is, what did I mean? Did I mean to also say you have rights to my house or not? Mishum debebayit below chatzir lo dairei inshe. Nobody lives in a house that doesn't have a courtyard. But I'm still physically here. It's not like I said I'm moving somewhere else. I'm still here. So in terms of what did I mean when I said the words, I'm relinquishing my rights to my courtyard, did I include my house? Of course I included my house because house and chatzera go hand in hand. But it doesn't mean that I'm as if I'm living in some other courtyard, in which case you can relinquish your rights back to me. And Shmuel will say the opposite. Ana de amri afilu k'Rabbanan. Rabbanan said you can't use my house. It's not because I'm still actually really like I'm living here, and therefore, I'm part of the same chatzer. We look very literally at my words. What did I say? I'm relinquishing my rights to the courtyard. I said courtyard. I didn't say house, so I meant only courtyard. But really, and this is Shmuel's reading, Shmuel has to say, if aim mevatlin, chosrenu mevatlin, it's because we view me as if I live in a different courtyard. So I say courtyard, that means I have no rights to the courtyard, which means I basically don't live in this courtyard. So even though you still have rights to my house and I'm still physically there, it's as if because I said I don't have rights to the courtyard, I don't have rights to the courtyard. Even the rabbis will agree with that. Okay, so they basically each explained it in their own way, and it's not necessarily connected. Amar Rav Acha bar Chana, Amar Rav Sheshet, he explains it's like a different machloket Tanaim, Kitanai. Misha Natan Rishuto. Okay, now again, we talk about relinquishing rights. I relinquish my rights to the courtyard, which means I'm not allowed to carry from my house to the courtyard anymore. What if I did? Is that a cancellation of my relinquishing of rights? Because I'm basically saying, oh, I'm using the courtyard, right? Which means I'm not relinquishing my rights. So if Hotzi, Bein B'Shogeg, Bein B'Mezid, it doesn't matter if I intentionally did it. I knew I relinquished my rights and I didn't care and I did it anyway. Or if I, by accident, like Rava, who was worried I was going to forget, I accidentally walked out. Osel, everyone becomes forbidden now in the courtyard because I basically canceled my relinquishing of rights. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, b'mezid oser, b'shogeg eno oser. Only if I did it intentionally, not if it was unintentional. So my la baka miflage, is this not the root of the machloket? Demar savar mevatzlim b'chozlin u'mevatzlim, umar savar ein mevatzlim b'chozlin u'mevatzlim. In other words, if we say bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, right? You're basically saying I haven't really removed myself entirely, and therefore any act I do can cancel it. Therefore, if I even do it unintentionally, I'm going to cancel it. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda, I've totally removed myself. And therefore, and therefore, only if I did it intentionally, is it going to actually undo what I did. But if I really remove myself, then undoing has to be done in a much more serious manner. And therefore, again, if I've removed myself, then Shmuel will say, if I didn't really remove myself fully, then that's Rav. So now they say, no. That's not the debate. Everyone thinks you can't. And really, it's only if, right, it's only Maisie that's really gonna, because you're really removed. And therefore, it's only intentional that's gonna mess you up. But why does Rabbi Meir say also shogeg? Their machloket is, do we penalize you for shgaga, for unintentional, in case you then think it's okay to do it intentionally? So therefore, he says, Mar savar kanso shogeg atu mezi. Rabbi Meir says, we're going to be stringent, and even if you were unintentional, and Mar savar lo kanso, but Rabbi Yehuda thinks not shogeg atu, right? Lo kanso shogeg atu mezi. And that's a machloket that has nothing to do with how much you really removed yourself. Really, everyone would think you really did remove yourself entirely. It's just a matter of, are we penalizing you extra for shgaga so that you don't think I can also intentionally carry items out. But we end with Rav Ashi Amar Rav Shmuel beplugta to Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan kabiflage. Even though we rejected the first machloket, we say, in fact, that really is the debate. Okay, whether you relinquished your rights to both your house and your chatzer, if that's the case, then you really removed yourself. And according to the one who says, no, you only relinquish rights to your courtyard, not your house, right? And that no one can actually bring items into your house because your house is yours and not theirs. They can only bring items to the courtyard. Then you're really saying that you're still a member of the courtyard. If that's the case, they can relinquish their rights to you after you've relinquished your rights to them. Okay, and we do say it's based on that debate, or at least Rav Ashi says that. Okay, now we're moving on to the last line in the Mishnah. We were at the Mishnah many days ago. So if you remember at the end of the Mishnah, Amar Rabban Gamliel, the Mishnah started off with a nochri, and basically you have to do shiur from a nochri, and then from a Gentile you have to rent, and with a Jew you do relinquishing of rights. So now they say, what about a tzduki? So Rabban Gamliel says, Maseh b'tzduki echad she'adar imanu. Remember, tzduki is someone who doesn't, right, calls himself a Jew, is one of these sects that they're Jewish, but they don't believe in the same masoret of Torah Shabbat, the same tradition that the rabbis held by. So first they asked, Tzduki mandachar shmei, where on earth did a tzduki come into the Mishnah? We weren't talking about tzduki before. And does someone disagree with Rabban Gamliel? It's not clear. So basically he says, the Maaseh, by the way, we'll read it again, but in case you don't remember, he basically says that the tzduki can relinquish their rights, just like a Jew. So they're basically going to say there's actually a machloket in the Mishnah, even though it didn't say so. And then they're going to prove it from a Braita that actually explicitly says there's a machloket. Tzduki hareu kenochri, according to Tanakama, really it's if it's missing the words that tzduki is treated like a nochri, and you have to actually rent rights from it. It's a radical thing, and it's interesting to see different approaches to how they viewed the tzdukim. Do they view them as not Jews at all, right? For this purpose, they're viewing them as if they're not Jews. And part of the issue is because they don't believe in Eruv. If you don't believe in Eruv, then you're basically considered like a Gentile for this purpose. I don't think he would think it across the board, but on this issue, yes. And then Rabban Gamliel Omer, Tzduki Eino Kenochri. No, we don't treat Tzduki as a Gentile. V'amar Rabban Gamliel, and then he continues to give them Maaseh Tzduki Echad, She'adar Imanu b'Mavoi b'Yerushalayim. He lived with us in Yerushalayim. V'amar Lanu Abba, and our father said, Maharu v'otziwa takelim l'Mavoi ad shelo yotzi v'yasor alechem. Bring your stuff out so that you claim rights to this place, so that he basically can't undo his relinquishing of rights. We're worried. He relinquished his rights to everybody, but we're worried. So basically take ownership of this mavoi to kind of prevent him from undoing what he did. V'hatanya, and here we're going to see a braita that proves this reading. Hadarim anochrit tzduki ubaitusi hare'elu osrim alav. According to Tanakama, they forbid you. They're like a Gentile. Baitusim was another sect. And whether you read this or not, it all means the same thing. Rabban Gamliel Omer Tzduki Ubaitusi Enan Osrim. It's in parentheses, so maybe don't read it. They don't forbid. Umaaseh Tzduki Echad. In any case, the story supports this. Maaseh Tzduki Echad She'adarim Rabban Gamliel b'Mavo b'Yerushalayim. There was a Tzduki who lived in the same alley. V'amar lahem Rabban Gamliel lebanav. It's a minor change from the other one. Here, it's not Rabban Gamliel's father. It's Rabban Gamliel himself. Said to his sons, Banai Maharu v'otziu Masha Atem Motziim v'achnisu Masha Atem Machnisim ad shelo yotzi atoev hazeh. Here, this despicable person. He didn't like the Tzdukim, but it's not that he still called them Gentiles. Because look, he already relinquished his rights, so make sure you kind of do your thing and prevent him from undoing what he did. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'lashon acheret, this we saw in the Mishnah, and we're going to, the continuation, we're not going to delve into this today. That will be the subject of the next shiur, which is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, who said it a little bit differently, that what he said was, do anything you need to do before Shabbat comes in, because Yasor can be because he might undo what he did. Okay, again, I don't want to even fill in the blank because there's some different explanations of Rabbi Yehuda's explanation that we're going to see as we go on. So Rabbi Yehuda had a bit of a different version about how it all worked, but the main thing you see is that either whether you hold by Rabbi Meir or you hold by Rabbi Yehuda, that Tzduki is viewed as a Jew for these purposes and not as a Gentile, and it's bitul reshut, it's the issue, relinquishing rights, and not the issue of renting from him. Okay, we'll end here for today. Shabbat shalom, everybody.